Hey there everybody, it's Dan Harris, host of the FantasyPros Football Podcast. Thanks for checking out our video series. Today we're going to be talking about my top 5 sleepers and my top 5 busts for week 3 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Let's start with sleepers here, and at number 5 it's Jeff Wilson. Jerick McKinnon is the better start in my opinion, unless we hear that Kyle Shanahan is going to give a firm indication that Wilson will be the guy. But Wilson is also a prime sleeper this week, with Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman out. Shanahan has used Wilson as the goal line back before, even with a far healthier backfield, and he's even carried the load at times in past years with upwards of 20 touches in games. George Kittle and Jimmy Garoppolo seem unlikely to play here, and even with their defensive injuries, the 49ers should be able to beat the Giants and have a positive game script throughout. All that should mean that Wilson sees double digits in carries, and with potential goal line work, he makes a fine sleeper in week 3. At number 4, it's Michael Pittman Jr. Quick, without looking it up, name a Jets cornerback. Seriously, the Jets' pass defense is abysmal. Pittman should see increased targets now with Paris Campbell on IR, and with Jack Doyle again iffy, and he's the type of big-bodied wide receiver that has had success with Phillip Rivers in the past. Pittman isn't a guarantee. It's certainly possible that the Colts, who are huge favorites in this game, can just run the ball all day long, even if that is the quote-unquote strength of the Jets defense. But any receiver who is likely to see 6+ targets against the Jets is worthy of sleeper consideration, and Pittman fits that bill. At number 3, it's Russell Gage. Gage is still out there in a lot of leagues, and that's just a bad job by fantasy managers. 21 targets through 2 games. An average of more than 8 targets per game since the second half of last season, on a team with a terrible defense that loves to throw the ball. If that is not enough for you, Julio Jones aggravated his hamstring injury, and his outlook for the game against the Bears this week is questionable. Now, the Bears defense generally limits wide receivers, but Buster Skrine, though he has played better this season, is the weak link in that secondary. There's very little to dislike about Gage's fantasy prospects. If you're hurting at wide receiver, he's a great target. At number 2, let's check out Corey Davis. Fantasy managers seem disappointed in Davis given his opportunity last week since he saw only 5 targets. But, he did find the end zone, and it's not like he was this huge disappointment. And he won't be this week either, against a Minnesota secondary that rivals the Jets in futility. Ryan Tannehill has continued to play extremely well, and A.J. Brown's bone bruise sounds likely to keep him out for another week. That should mean plenty of targets, and most likely open ones, for Davis. And my top sleeper for this week, it's Joshua Kelley. Now, I could list guys like Mike Davis here, but you know about him already. Kelley, however, is still a guy who is available in some places, and who you should not only pick up, but consider starting this week. Kelley is averaging more than 18 touches per game this season, and he is going to get the goal line work for the Chargers. It's Carolina. Running backs score touchdowns against Carolina. Through 2 games, running backs have rushed for 6 touchdowns this season. That is an absurd number until you remember that Carolina allowed 27 rushing touchdowns to running backs last year. Kelley is a solid start this week, and he may carve out an every week starting role going forward. All right, let's turn now to our week 3 busts, and kicking us off at number 5 is David Johnson. It's not Johnson's fault. He looked great in week 1, and he ran into a tough opponent in week 2 with Baltimore. But he's got another difficult opponent here in Pittsburgh, which is tough on running backs. Johnson has seen an average of 13.5 touches in his first 2 games, and with Duke Johnson sounding likely to play, there's no reason for that number to increase. So when you're capped at low double-digit touches in a really tough matchup, that has bust potential written all over it. At number 4, it's DJ Moore. You are starting DJ Moore, stop yelling at me. But he's currently being ranked as a borderline wide receiver 1 this week, while I have him closer to a wide receiver 2. It's a tough matchup for Moore, who will likely be shadowed by Casey Hayward, given that he has, in the past, shadowed smaller wide receivers, and that Michael Davis is a much better match for Robbie Anderson. Hayward is really, really good, and the Panthers no longer have the threat of the best running back in the game for the Chargers defense to worry about. They can play ball control football and grind it out, leaving less time of possession for the Panthers. You're not benching Moore, but there's certainly bust potential. At number 3, it's Todd Gurley. How many receiving yards does Todd Gurley have this year? The answer is 1 more than you do. Seriously. 2 shootouts, 1 receiving yard. 21 carries last week was good, 61 yards rushing and 0 targets was bad. If Julio Jones misses this game, then Gurley could potentially see more work, and anyone getting 20 touches per game is worth fantasy consideration, especially in a matchup against the Bears that has not looked that tough for running backs. But Gurley has forced 0 missed tackles through 2 games, and without the floor of passing game work, he's no longer a locked-in RB2 as he was on draft day. Number 2 is John Brown. It's going to be amazing if Josh Allen keeps up his current pace, in which case Brown is almost going to certainly outperform his draft day value. He has touchdowns in both games thus far, and he's on pace for more than 1,200 receiving yards. But the Rams secondary is legitimate. We don't necessarily know if Jalen Ramsey will square up against Brown or Stephon Diggs or both, but Darius Williams has played extremely well so far this season anyway. The Rams are not a defense you all out avoid, but you do acknowledge that your receivers who go up against them may be held in check. That's exactly the situation here with Brown, and to a lesser extent Diggs. But given Diggs' target share, Brown makes the bust list instead. And number 1 on the bust list this week is Drew Brees. 4.82 air yards per pass right now. That is ridiculous. You've got competing forces here. On the one side, you have Drew Brees at home, in a primetime, in a game with a high over-under. On the other, you have literally everything else. Brees has looked terrible so far. Michael Thomas is likely not going to play. If you're an opposing defense, you are daring Brees to throw it downfield and beat you right now. And without Thomas, that means it's got to be Emmanuel Sanders, who looks terrible, or Traquan Smith or Jared Cook. I actually don't think Brees is done entirely despite the growing narrative. But I also don't think you can start him if you have any reasonable other option, particularly with Thomas out. Thanks for checking out our top 5 sleepers and top 5 busts for week 3 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Let me know in the comments where you think I'm wrong, where you think I'm right, or any commentary that you have. Make sure to follow us over on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @FantasyPros so you don't miss any of the great content that we're going to continue to put out all season long.